India and Israel are conducting joint military operations that neither government will publicly acknowledge, and the implications are staggering. We are not talking about diplomatic cooperation or trade agreements. We are talking about intelligence sharing at levels typically reserved for NATO allies, weapons systems being co-developed in secret facilities, and strategic coordination that is fundamentally reshaping power dynamics from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to show you is one of the most consequential geopolitical developments of the past decade that has received almost zero mainstream coverage. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly how these two nations, separated by thousands of miles with no shared borders and radically different diplomatic histories, have constructed an alliance that threatens to upend strategic calculations in three separate regions simultaneously. I am going to show you precisely what this alliance consists of, how it operates beneath the surface of public diplomacy, and why it represents a nightmare scenario for Pakistan, a major complication for China, and a strategic asset for Western interests that Washington is quietly encouraging. We will cover the intelligence apparatus that connects Mossad and RAW, the weapons programs being jointly developed that other nations cannot match, and the economic corridors that are being constructed to bypass traditional choke points controlled by adversaries. By the end, you will understand why this is not just another bilateral relationship, but a fundamental restructuring of how two rising powers are positioning themselves for long-term competition against shared adversaries. Let me start with what most people do not understand about the history here, because the transformation is recent and dramatic. India, for most of its post-independence history, maintained a foreign policy of non-alignment that leaned distinctly toward the Arab world and the Palestinian cause. This was not accidental. India's large Muslim population, its energy dependence on Gulf oil, and its Cold War positioning all incentivized close relationships with Arab states and distance from Israel. India did not formally recognize Israel until 1992, 44 years after Israeli independence. Even after recognition, relations remained cool and largely commercial. Trade existed, but strategic cooperation was genuinely minimal and carefully hidden to avoid antagonizing Arab partners and domestic Muslim constituencies. The shift began in the late 1990s and accelerated dramatically and decisively after 2014, when Narendra Modi became Prime Minister of India. Modi made three critical decisions that transformed the relationship. First, he publicly embraced Israel without the traditional diplomatic hedging that characterized previous Indian governments. He became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel in 2017, and he did so without the customary accompanying visit to Palestine that every previous leader had included. Second, he authorized unprecedented levels of intelligence and defense cooperation that went far beyond what previous governments would consider. Third, he reframed the relationship in explicitly strategic terms, emphasizing shared threats from Islamic terrorism and shared interests in containing Chinese and Pakistani influence. Israel reciprocated enthusiastically because this relationship solves several strategic problems simultaneously. Israel gains access to a massive market for defense exports, a major power willing to coordinate on Iran, and diplomatic cover in international forums where it is often isolated. India gains access to some of the world's most sophisticated military technology, intelligence cooperation against Pakistan-based terrorist networks, and a partner willing to share cyber warfare and counter-terrorism expertise that few nations possess. The complementarity is nearly perfect, and both sides recognized it. The defense relationship is where this alliance becomes genuinely significant. India is now Israel's largest arms customer globally, purchasing over $1 billion worth of Israeli military equipment annually. But these are not just standard commercial transactions. We are talking about cutting-edge systems that Israel typically reserves for close allies. The Falcon airborne early warning system, which provides India with 360-degree radar coverage, capable of detecting aircraft and missiles at ranges exceeding 200 miles. The Barak 8 long-range surface-to-air missile system, co-developed by India and Israel, which provides both nations with advanced air defense capabilities against aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic threats. The Heron and Searcher unmanned aerial vehicles that have given the Indian military persistent surveillance capabilities that it previously lacked. These are not incremental improvements to existing Indian capabilities. These are category-changing systems that fundamentally enhance what the Indian military can do. But the truly significant cooperation is not in weapons sales. It is in joint development programs that create capabilities neither nation could achieve independently. The Barak 8 program is instructive. Israel needed a next-generation naval air defense system but lacked the resources to develop it alone. India needed the same capability but lacked the technical expertise. The solution was a joint venture where Israeli aerospace industries provided the technological foundation, Indian defense research organizations contributed engineering resources and testing facilities, and both nations shared development costs. The result is a missile system that both nations now deploy and that competes with the best American and European systems. This is not client and supplier. This is genuine co-development between technological peers. The same pattern repeats in multiple domains. Spike anti-tank missiles are being produced under license in India, with technology transfer that allows Indian engineers to understand and modify the systems. Drone technology is being shared in both directions, with Israeli firms gaining access to Indian AI research and Indian military gaining access to Israeli operational experience. Cyber warfare capabilities, which Israel has developed through decades of operations against Iranian nuclear facilities and Hezbollah networks, are being shared with Indian intelligence agencies facing cyber threats from Chinese and Pakistani actors. This technology transfer creates a multiplier effect where both nations benefit far more than from simple arms sales. The intelligence relationship may be even more significant than the defense relationship, though it is far more opaque by necessity. What we know comes from occasional leaks, oblique official statements, and analysis of operational outcomes that suggest coordination. Mossad and the Research and Analysis Wing have established direct communication channels that bypass normal diplomatic structures. This allows real-time intelligence sharing on terrorist threats, Iranian activities, and Chinese strategic moves. Reports indicate that Indian intelligence provided critical information to Israel about Iranian weapons shipments moving through the Indian Ocean to Hezbollah. Israeli intelligence has reciprocated with information about Pakistani nuclear scientists' movements and Chinese intelligence operations in South Asia. This level of sharing typically exists only between nations with formal alliances like the Five Eyes Partnership between the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. India and Israel have created something approaching that level of trust and integration without any formal treaty structure. The counterterrorism dimension deserves particular attention because it reveals operational cooperation beyond just intelligence sharing. Israeli security firms and advisors have trained Indian special forces in urban counterterrorism tactics, developed through decades of operations in Gaza and the West Bank. Indian commandos have trained at Israeli facilities learning building entry techniques, hostage rescue protocols, and tunnel warfare tactics that proved critical when Indian forces have confronted militants in Kashmir. The Mumbai attacks in 2008, where Pakistani terrorists killed 166 people, created a watershed moment. Indian security forces struggled to respond effectively, and the shortcomings were brutally exposed. In the aftermath, India turned to Israel for help redesigning its counterterrorism infrastructure. Israeli advisors helped restructure Indian commando units, improve interagency coordination, and develop quick reaction capabilities that did not previously exist. The relationship became deeply operational, not just consultative. The geographic logic of this alliance is what makes it strategically powerful beyond bilateral benefits. Look at a map and the pattern becomes immediately clear. Israel sits at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, controlling access points and maintaining intelligence collection capabilities across the Middle East and beyond. India sits at the center of the Indian Ocean region, controlling sea lanes that carry the majority of global energy supplies and a massive percentage of Chinese trade volumes. Together, these positions create strategic coverage across a massive arc extending from the Mediterranean through the Persian Gulf to the Malacca Strait. This geographic complementarity allows both nations to monitor and potentially interdict adversary activities across a region that contains some of the world's most critical choke points and conflict zones. The maritime dimension is particularly important and significantly underappreciated in strategic analysis. Israel has limited blue water naval capabilities by virtue of its geographic constraints, but possesses extensive experience with submarine operations, coastal defense systems, and maritime interdiction tactics in confined waters developed over decades of operations. India is systematically building a blue water navy designed to project power across the Indian Ocean basin, but requires advanced submarine technology and sophisticated coastal defense systems to protect its extensive coastline. Israeli Dolphin-class submarines, widely believed to carry nuclear-capable cruise missiles providing second strike capability, represent a technological achievement Israel has offered to share operational expertise about with Indian submarine programs currently under development. Indian naval doctrine increasingly focuses on controlling the Indian Ocean and monitoring Chinese naval expansion through the string-of-pearls strategy of port construction across the region. Israeli maritime surveillance technology and hard-won operational experience complement Indian naval expansion perfectly, creating synergies neither nation could achieve independently. Pakistan represents the most immediate and operationally significant shared adversary, where this alliance has direct and measurable operational consequences on the ground. Pakistan's relationship with China is deep, multifaceted, and strategically critical for both nations. China provides Pakistan with weapons systems, nuclear technology, economic investment through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and diplomatic support in international forums. Pakistan provides China with access to Gwadar Port, which gives China a presence in the Indian Ocean and serves as a counterweight to Indian regional influence. The India-Israel alliance is, in significant part, a response to the China-Pakistan axis. Israeli weapons and intelligence help India monitor and counter Pakistani military capabilities. Indian strategic pressure on Pakistan complicates China's strategic depth and divides Chinese attention between multiple fronts. The intelligence cooperation against Pakistan-based terrorism is where this gets genuinely operational. Groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which have conducted major attacks in India, maintain complex international networks that move fighters, weapons, and money across multiple countries. Tracking these networks requires capabilities that exceed what any single intelligence service can maintain. Israeli signals intelligence assets developed for monitoring Hezbollah and Hamas are reportedly shared with India for tracking similar networks operating from Pakistan. Indian human intelligence networks in the Middle East, particularly in Gulf states where many South Asians work, provide information about fundraising and recruitment that Israeli services find valuable for their own operations. The synergy is significant and operational rather than just theoretical. Iran presents a more complicated case because India and Israel have opposite interests in some dimensions, while sharing concerns in others. India has historically maintained functional relationships with Iran, driven by energy needs and the strategic value of Chabahar Port as an alternative to Pakistani routes into Afghanistan and Central Asia. Israel views Iran as an existential threat and conducts ongoing covert operations to disrupt Iranian nuclear and missile programs. You would expect these contradictory positions to create friction in the India-Israel relationship. They have not, at least not enough to disrupt the broader alliance. The solution has been implicit compartmentalization. India does not participate in Israeli operations against Iran and maintains its economic and diplomatic relationships. Israel does not pressure India to rupture ties with Tehran, but India does share intelligence about Iranian activities that threaten mutual interests, and Israel reciprocates with information about Iranian support for proxies that could threaten Indian interests. The relationship has proven flexible enough to accommodate these differences. China represents the most strategically significant shared concern and the dimension where the India-Israel alliance has the greatest potential to reshape regional dynamics. China's Belt and Road Initiative, its expanding presence in the Indian Ocean, its partnership with Pakistan, and its increasingly sophisticated military capabilities all threaten both Indian and Israeli interests, though in different ways. For India, China represents a direct territorial threat with ongoing border disputes, a strategic competitor for influence across South Asia and the Indian Ocean, and an economic rival. For Israel, China represents a long-term strategic concern as it expands influence in the Middle East, potentially shifts away from reliance on Western technology markets that limit Israel's options, and develops military capabilities that could be transferred to adversaries. The India-Israel response to Chinese expansion includes several components. First, both nations are developing capabilities specifically designed to counter Chinese systems. Indian air defense systems need to counter Chinese aircraft and missiles. Israeli systems need to deal with similar threats. Co-development allows both nations to field competitive capabilities faster than independent development would allow. Second, both nations are working to limit Chinese access to critical technologies. Israel has faced American pressure to restrict technology transfers to China, particularly in areas like telecommunications and cybersecurity. India has banned Chinese apps and companies from sensitive sectors. This coordination is not explicitly announced, but the pattern suggests alignment. Third, both nations are developing alternative economic corridors that bypass Chinese-controlled infrastructure. This is where the India-Middle East-Europe economic corridor becomes relevant. The I2U2 initiative, which connects India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, represents an ambitious attempt to create transportation and energy infrastructure that provides alternatives to Chinese Belt and Road routes. The vision is a transportation corridor running from India through the Middle East to Europe, with Israeli and Emirati ports serving as critical nodes. This corridor would allow goods to move from India to Europe faster and more efficiently than either maritime routes through the Suez Canal or overland routes through China and Central Asia. The strategic logic is creating connectivity that does not depend on Chinese infrastructure or goodwill. Israel's geographic position and port facilities at Haifa and Ashdod become critical links in this chain. Indian goods arrive at Emirati ports, move through Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and ship from Israeli ports to Europe. This routing bypasses the Suez Canal and creates redundancy in global supply chains. The economic dimension of the India-Israel relationship extends beyond defense and infrastructure. Bilateral trade has grown from essentially nothing in 1992 to over $10 billion annually. But more significant than the volume is the composition. This is not commodity trade. This is advanced technology, pharmaceuticals, and high-value services. Israeli agricultural technology is transforming Indian farming in water-scarce regions. Israeli desalination expertise is being applied to Indian water security challenges. Indian IT services are supporting Israeli tech companies. Indian pharmaceutical manufacturing is producing Israeli-designed drugs. This is deep economic integration in sectors that matter for long-term development and that create stakeholder constituencies in both nations who benefit from sustained cooperation. The diplomatic component is where this alliance shows its limitations and where both nations still hedge carefully. India has not, and likely will not, abandon its traditional support for Palestinian statehood or fully align with Israeli positions in international forums. India abstains or votes against Israel on Palestinian issues at the United Nations more often than not. Israel understands this and accepts it as the price of the broader relationship. Similarly, Israel maintains relationships with nations that India views as problematic, particularly in the Gulf where Israeli-Saudi rapprochement has accelerated. Both nations recognize that public diplomatic alignment is less important than substantive cooperation in defense, intelligence, and economic spheres. The relationship is transactional and pragmatic rather than ideological, which ironically makes it more stable because it does not depend on shared values or public solidarity. The technology transfer implications extend beyond immediate military capabilities into long-term strategic autonomy. India has struggled for decades with defense dependence on Russia, which has proven increasingly problematic as Russian equipment quality has declined and geopolitical alignment has shifted. The United States has been reluctant to provide India with the most advanced systems or comprehensive technology transfer due to concerns about Indian non-alignment and potential leakage to Russia. Israel occupies a unique middle position. Israeli technology is often comparable to American systems, but Israel is more willing to transfer technology and allow Indian modification and production. This gives India a path toward defense autonomy that neither American purchases nor Russian dependence provided. For Israel, the financial return from Indian contracts helps fund development programs that would otherwise be prohibitively expensive for a small nation. The counterargument to all of this is that the relationship remains inherently limited by geography, by India's need to maintain relationships across the Islamic world, and by Israel's small size relative to India's great power ambitions. These are real constraints. India will never fully align with Israel against the Islamic world because India needs Gulf oil, has substantial Muslim domestic population, and maintains strategic interests in Iran and Afghanistan that require functional relationships with Islamic nations. Israel cannot provide India with the full spectrum of capabilities a great power requires because Israel's economy and defense industrial base are simply too small. The United States or potentially Europe remain essential partners for India's long-term strategic needs. These limitations are real, and analysts who dismiss the India-Israel relationship as fundamentally constrained by these factors have legitimate points. But the counterargument to the counterargument is that the relationship does not need to be exclusive or comprehensive to be strategically significant. India is pursuing multi-alignment, maintaining partnerships with the United States, Russia, France, Israel, and others simultaneously. Each relationship serves different purposes and provides different capabilities. Israel fills specific niches that other partners cannot or will not fill. The intelligence sharing against terrorism, the willingness to transfer sensitive technology, the operational cooperation in cyber and special operations domains, and the absence of political conditionality that Western partners often impose all create value that India cannot easily replicate elsewhere. Similarly, Israel gains from the Indian relationship in ways that even the American alliance does not provide. Access to a billion-person market, partnership with a major power that is not subject to the political volatility of American elections, and alignment with a nation that is positioned to become one of the world's largest economies all serve Israeli long-term interests. What should you be watching for going forward that would indicate this relationship is deepening or potentially facing strains? First, watch for announcements of new joint development programs, particularly in emerging technology domains like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and space systems. If India and Israel begin cooperating in these areas, it indicates the relationship is evolving beyond traditional defense into the technologies that will define future strategic competition. Second, watch for Israeli participation in major Indian military exercises like Malabar, which currently includes the United States, Japan, and Australia. Israeli participation would signal a willingness to more publicly align, despite the diplomatic sensitivities. Third, watch for Indian diplomatic positions on Middle East issues. Any shift toward more explicit support for Israeli positions or away from traditional Palestinian solidarity would indicate domestic political calculations have changed in ways that allow deeper public alignment. Fourth, watch for Chinese responses. If China begins pressuring nations to choose between Chinese partnerships and Israeli relationships, or if Chinese state media begins highlighting the India-Israel alliance as evidence of an anti-China coalition, that indicates Beijing views this as a genuine strategic threat rather than a manageable bilateral relationship. Fifth, watch for American encouragement or facilitation of the relationship. Washington has quietly supported the India-Israel partnership because it aligns with American strategic interests in containing Chinese expansion and countering terrorism. If the United States begins more explicitly facilitating trilateral cooperation or providing platforms for India-Israel coordination, that suggests Washington sees this as a critical component of Indo-Pacific strategy. The conclusion here is that the India-Israel alliance represents one of the most significant strategic realignments of the post-Cold War era, and it has occurred largely beneath the notice of mainstream analysis. Two nations with radically different histories, geographic positions, and diplomatic traditions have constructed a relationship that provides both with capabilities and strategic options they would not otherwise possess. This is not a formal alliance with treaty obligations. It is something more flexible and in some ways more durable, a partnership based on concrete mutual benefits in intelligence, defense technology, counterterrorism, and strategic coordination against shared adversaries. The implications extend across multiple regions and multiple domains of competition. Pakistan faces a more capable Indian military equipped with Israeli technology and intelligence. China faces coordinated resistance to its Belt and Road Initiative and its Indian Ocean expansion. Iran faces intelligence cooperation that enhances Israeli operational capabilities. And both India and Israel gain strategic autonomy and options that enhance their positions in an increasingly multipolar world. If this analysis helped you understand why two nations separated by thousands of miles are constructing one of the 21st century's most consequential partnerships, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering Iran's nuclear facility going offline next, and that story involves Israeli operations that have not been publicly acknowledged, but have potentially changed the entire timeline for Iranian nuclear weapons capability. This is States News, and we are just getting started.